That's special. That's more than you know, but I know after when you give it back, I mean, maybe that's a type of maple substance. But I'm trying to think if else to do that. It's a baker. That's said big reception. Was it was very different. No, was it? No, I definitely know because I have heard it very long. They're so special. Really, this time of year they're just so good. Yeah, they had a little suburb went there and.
Yeah, I mean, he's better than
yeah, I know. Give up their land, right? Went down and prayed. There was eight of us upstairs. We were just getting together to catch up and just talk. They were coming. They have Shelby's restaurant near the post. So we met there, and it's there this summer. I've worked with them before, and I haven't seen them in a while, but we all get together. And we haven't been together in a couple of months, but today somebody wanted to do it. And I got there early, got to get a table for us, but it is. And that's Diane Ross birthday card. He texted me back that it's so much better. That maybe towards the end of August we can get together. She's gonna work on Monday. That's why change space. Very suddenly left. And she's able to get house upstairs in the attic now, get up there and stuff. Did you get to talk to Good. That's fine.
I'm going to start with my announcements in a few minutes, but while we have this time, I guess I'll let everyone know, so that we have a few members here, we are opening back up to the public tomorrow. It's been a tough month. This is actually the first time I've dressed up in a month. I'm sweating so profusely. I'm like, oh my God. So I apologize. Apparently I'm not used to getting dressed up. The cleanup was extensive. If anybody has any questions about it. No buildings were damaged, which is unreal. I do have some pictures of the next day that at some point maybe we'll share with everybody, but you wouldn't believe it. And then to see just we're 3 weeks later that we're ready to go, it's great. So We will be open tomorrow, and next weekend we are doing military days, which is our big. And I think I heard some folks asking about the 1860s event that was canceled. And just so I can be clear, the 1860s event was a placeholder for Civil War Days. Basically, Civil War Days is our annual reenactment event. But because it's America 250, good luck finding any reenactors in the month of July. So we decided to do a civilian event in July and then move the military event to August. And then because it's America 250, we decided to expand it. So we'll have Red War, Spanish-American War, French and Indian War, I think, World War I, Civil War reenactors all here. Oh, and we just secured United States Colored Troop reenactors. So it's going to be really, really awesome. So we'll be doing the same things that we usually do for Civil War Days, except we'll be spread out throughout the campus. We'll be doing the firing demonstrations up in the pasture and all the other things that we do. So that'll be next weekend. Any questions about the cleanup or how the site's doing?
How many trees did you have to remove?
Too many to count, sir. Too many to count. I will point out for those of you who have been coming to Landis for a while, you know, if you do get a chance to go out there on site, you will notice some of the older trees. We had a tree right outside of the brother's house. I think it's been here for 100 and maybe 50 years. And the storm crafted it.
Oh, wow.
So they had to cut it down, and it was really hard. Mm-hmm. And I mean, for the most part, we look a little bare out there. I'm not gonna lie. I think we do have a plan moving forward, probably starting in the fall, where we'll probably start looking at some kind of a tree planting initiative. We may even involve members. There might be an opportunity for members to plant trees. There'll be some things that we're going to do, but and you know, I look at it glass half full for sure. It could have been a lot worse. And to be honest with you, we're getting such amazing coverage from it on the news. Okay. As you saw, WGL marked that back. They were gonna. I mean, they asked if they could interview somebody who come in. What? Well. But yeah, so there's been a little bit of a silver lining, and we'll see. You know, what we're really hoping is that we can make up for July and August. Y'all had a great events in August. So. Okay, so here's my spiel. Welcome to Landis Valley. How many of you here are members currently? Okay, almost the whole room. Great. If you are not a member, this is a benefit of membership. If you paid your $10 to come this evening, thank you very much for contributing to our mission. But if you are a member, these are all free. And you know, we have a few more of these next month. We've got Dr. Scott Shealy will be talking about market to market Lancaster. It's a Lancaster Foodways. It's like he just changed the title, so I'm trying to remember what the title is. It's about Lancaster Foodways and the transportation from basically early farm to table and history from that standpoint. So. We have William Boyce Weaver will be here. I believe that is in October. In September, we have Lynette. That's right. Lynette is here in, she's doing fashion of the 1800s, I believe. Yep. And then our keynote speaker will be in November. That'll actually be a Wednesday night because it is our annual members meeting. So the keynote speaker for that will be John Kohler. John is helping us curate the Gunsmiths of the Early Republic exhibit, which opens next March. Okay, we're currently working on that. So, and that'll be right here in Visitor Center. So once again, this is my pitch. If you are already a member, thank you very much for your support. If you are not a member, this is just one of the many benefits, including free access, free admission, to the site on regular days and on signature days, signature events, discounts that we give shop, and a whole bunch of other things that we provide as part of the membership. So thank you very much. 6? Am I stalled?
6.
Perfect. Okay. So tonight we're very excited to have Phil Gruber from Lancaster Farming. As I understand it, this is a brand new presentation that he is doing for the first time here tonight. So we're very special for us to get that special attention. So I'm going to go ahead and ask Phil to come on up and tell us all about Farmer Rebellions. Thank you, Phil.
So freedom seemed to have been achieved. The United States had won its freedom from Great Britain in a revolution that had taken the better part of a decade and had stretched the entirety of the colonies across the ocean. Surely now there would be peace and prosperity. People would be happy with their lot. The farmers who had made the bulk of a nation's people would be able to grow. But in the 1780s and 1790s, it didn't always work like that. In 3 major rebellions, including 2 in Pennsylvania, farmers took up arms against the state or federal government and were put down by force. What was it about this time period? Why would farmers take up arms multiple times in 20 years and then almost never again in American history down to the present day? What was going wrong in those first decades of American independence? Good evening, my name is Phil Gruber. I'm a reporter and editor at Lancaster Farming newspaper in Ephrata. A lot of what I do has to do with contemporary stuff, the ag policy, developments in farming production, that type of thing. But this year, in conjunction with the 250th celebration of the country, I've been doing this. We can go to the next slide. We'll see the logo. The long-form series called Agriculture 250, covering the story of agriculture throughout our time. Next slide. And so part of the reason I'm here tonight is Landis Valley is one of the first places I visited. And this is a photo I took here back in December, I think. We can go to the next slide. Just to give you a brief rundown of how I got to this talking about farmer rebellions. I started the series with a couple of pieces on colonial farming. So that began with the middle colonies, talking about the Pennsylvania Dutch. So I visited Landis Valley in the 1719 house. And then I talked about the New England farming and the conflict between settlers and Native American practices. In the South, of course, I talked about slavery. And then the series moved into the period of the early Republic. This is when the farmer rebellions, you can see the whiskey still right here. And we just published my piece about canals. It's online and it'll be in print pretty soon. And now I'm working on a piece about agriculture in the Civil War. I just saw the FAR photo in Virginia last week. So the other thing is I may get to the year 1900 by the end of the year. We'll see how that goes. But if we can go to the next slide. As I was researching farmer rebellions, I found that there was a similar pattern to how they evolved. Now, this is not some sort of formal historical theory. I'm not a trained historian or anything, but this is sort of my observation of how things went. So, looks like you'll have to click through to each of those. There's 5 on there. So, it begins with simmering anger, something that maybe develops over the course of years. Rebellions don't come out of nowhere. And there's something, it has to be pretty extreme too. In most cases, these rebellions were related to rights or taxes or both. And then there needs to be some sort of flashpoint, because just being upset is not enough to take up arms. So something happens when the farmers say enough is enough. And then the next one is the main attack. where there is some sort of violent action planned against the government. Often this is an attempt to capture an arsenal, because if you're the farmers, you got guns, but you maybe don't have the best guns. And, you know, if you can seize a stockpile of weapons, that gives you the firepower you need to continue and expand your rebellion. However, if we go to the next point, something goes wrong. Either the attack does not go as planned, they face more resistance than they did initially. Something happens where the farmers lose momentum. And then, as we see there, invariably, farmer rebellions ended in defeat. And as we'll see, the ways the victors acted toward the rebels at the end of the conflict said a lot about the government's motivation. Right, here we go. So what counts as a farmer rebellion? There were three main rebellions in the time period that we're looking at. Two of them you probably studied in school, one maybe not. Shays Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, and Freeze Rebellion. And as I was thinking about this, I wondered, you know, are there dimensions in which the Revolutionary War itself or the Civil War could be considered farmer rebellions? In both cases, there was this agrarian populace that rose up against a more powerful and more industrialized enemy. The US against Britain, the South against the North. So it has that going for the argument, but still, both of those conflicts were much more complicated and much larger. They involved urban as well as rural people. So if you wanted to advance some sort of comparison there, you probably need to go into some serious historical academic kind of writing. And I did not do that for tonight. But as we continue here, before we get into the early Republic period, I think it's helpful to look at one of the most notable farmer rebellions just before the Revolution. In the late 1760s, a few years before the Revolution kicks off in 1775, the backcountry farmers of North Carolina were seething with resentment against the local and the colonial governments. Corrupt officials, embezzlement. Some of these officials, it appears, were colluding with the farmers' creditors to get, you know, the better of the farmers. In addition, land taxes in North Carolina at the time were assessed equally on the productive coastal farmland, which was owned by the rich planters, and on the poor soil owned by the poor farmers in the upcountry. So this is not the last time we'll hear this tonight. The farmers had basically a higher effective tax rate. They were basically paying more than the people who had the means to pay. And in another theme that we'll run through tonight, these taxes were expected to be paid in hard currency. This was a problem because cash was in such short supply in the colonial and early republic days. The US mint was not really a thing until the end of the period we're talking about, as we're getting close to 1800. Currency is a commodity that can be bought, sold, imported, exported. And while it did get imported, it often did not get very far past Philadelphia, Boston, places like that. It did not go very far into the backcountry. For an example of the type of person who might be involved in a farmer rebellion, it's one of the more colorful characters is Herman Husband. He was one of the main leaders, or the main leader of the North Carolina regulators. He was deeply or even extremely religious. He believed that the New Jerusalem would be founded in North America. He had a wealthy background, and he had this surprising knack for both losing and gaining fortunes through agriculture. So in the midst of all this anger, the farmers started out peacefully enough petitioning the government, but Governor William Tryon basically called them whiners. They were not getting anywhere with the state. So in 1770, the regulators attacked some of the officials that they had the most problems with in the town of Hillsborough. In response, North Carolina passed the Riot Act, and the governor sent out troops. If you see the dot there, the red dot in the center of the state, or the colony at that point, in 1771, the Battle of Alamance, the regulators were crushed. Some fled the state, like Herman Husband. He went to Western Pennsylvania, in fact, and later played a sort of murky role in the Whiskey Rebellion. Some of the farmers were pardoned, others were executed. So this shows you some of the variety of responses that rebellions could receive. All right, we go to Shays' Rebellion. So this is one of the ones you probably remember seeing on some faded textbook page. This happened really in just a few years after the Treaty of Paris and the independence of the United States. The meat of this took place in 1786 and 1787. So, like I said, the U.S. had just won independence, but the economy was a mess. The problem was not importing. We had really gotten back into importing in a big way. Boston merchants were buying tons of stuff from England, to the point that there was a glut. But the exports had not picked up. The British were feeling probably a little bit vindictive toward the U.S. and closed the Caribbean market, which was one of the most important places to sell American farm products. France, was willing to deal with us a little bit, but we owed them a bunch of money. And this was the period where the Barbary pirates were picking up. So accessing Spain and Italy was difficult. So we have a situation where the Boston merchants are hugely indebted, and the London merchants are coming after them. So the Boston merchants turned to their customers, who are the country store owners, basically the general store owners of the day, who are throughout the interior of Massachusetts and New England. And these people can't pay. So they go after the farmers, and they start suing them like crazy. Farmers at this time usually bought on credit and paid later with crops. But, of course, nobody in this whole chain wants the crops. They want the hard currency, which the farmers don't have. So these are relatively small debts, but they were landing farmers in debtor's prison. It was causing farms to be sold off basically at sheriff sales, usually at rock bottom prices. And sort of in the background of all this, Massachusetts' tax system was based so heavily on land, even compared to other states. And this shifted the tax burden pretty heavily onto farmers. Because, if you're a merchant, your wealth is tied up in goods, not in land. So the farmers did what they had done during the Revolution, what they knew how to do. They formed these revolutionary conventions, basically where a bunch of people got together and wrote up some resolutions for what they demanded the government do. And this is because paper money depreciates, so it would make their debts smaller. So essentially, you think about inflation today, we hate it because our system is based so heavily on money that it, as inflation increases, it basically decreases the value of your money. But in this time period, in this situation, the farmers really kind of liked inflation. Of course, the government did not listen. In fact, they said, some people said, oh, the farmers just need to be more frugal, as if that was really an issue there. Things got even more heated as the farmers started forcibly closing the courts, because if the court doesn't operate, it can't take away your farm. However, that interference in the judicial process is not going to go over well with the government. So Massachusetts starts arresting some of the more annoying farmers. But the farmers start thinking, well, maybe this is a bigger thing than we're thinking, than maybe it really was. So it was time to act. And the farmers thought the place to go was to attack the Springfield Arsenal. The Springfield Arsenal was created by established by George Washington up the Connecticut River. The idea being it was out of the way enough that the British would never get there. And they didn't, but it also ended up being smack in the middle of the area of farmer protest. So it was a pretty tempting target, obviously. And as these farmers were getting together, the militia was also getting together. And it was being bankrolled by the Boston merchants, interestingly. And some of the militia intercepted orders to part of the rebel force, which meant that they attacked too early. And they were relying on a coordinated assault to make things successful. When that didn't work out, they basically fell apart. The militia chased them around the snowy countryside of Massachusetts that winter. And whenever they caught up to them, they roundly defeated them. So pretty quickly, Shays' Rebellion was over. Most participants were eventually pardoned. So this was in between Shays' Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion. Farmers in other states were also fighting debt collectors and the tax man. In South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, New Jersey, localized protests popped up. In December 1786, just as Shays' Rebellion was reaching its climax, a group of about 100 people from Manchester marched into York, Pennsylvania to rescue a cow that had been captured and been seized from a farmer who was behind on his tax debts. This is an interesting quote. This is from a history written 50 years after the fact, when Victorian prose was starting to come into fashion. With dread determination, they went to the place where her vaccine excellence was exposed to vendition, which is auctioning. And vaccine in this case comes from the Latin word, So a really kind of strange way to put it, but this became known as the York Cow Insurrection.
Really? Wow.
So this does sound kind of humorous in hindsight. But on the other hand, I think it shows the depth of the pain that was going on in the American farm economy at this time. The U.S. and the farm economy were both struggling, and this new country was just trying to get its feet under it. So now we'll go to the big one. The Whiskey Rebellion occurred just south of Pittsburgh. It started in 1789, but most of the activity happened in 1794. federal government needed money to repay its war debt. So the idea here was a whiskey tax. This was extremely offensive to the people in Western Pennsylvania. Whiskey was its main export. Rye was the main crop in that region. It grew well. The thing is, people didn't really want to eat rye that much, and bulk grain was extremely expensive to transport. And whiskey was much more valuable. It also helped that most of the people out there were Scots-Irish, so you think Scotch whiskey, these people knew how to make it. So this was known as Monongahela rye whiskey. It was a strong and clear beverage, as opposed to, for example, bourbon, which is a darker drink. It would come out of the same general whiskey making region later. So the whiskey tax was an attack. The whiskey tax was an attack on the farmer's identity, and it also became an attack on their livelihood. So there were already challenges brewing for the whiskey economy. It was more cost-effective to ship the grain, but it was still a huge cost to get whiskey from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia. It would have been much more desirable to just float it down the Ohio River. Even getting it to New Orleans, owned by the Spanish, would not have been out of the question. But trade on the Ohio was not yet open. So unless you wanted to do the black market, which a lot of people did, that was not a great option. Alexander Hamilton was the first Secretary of the Treasury, and he was not a mere cabinet secretary. He thought of himself having this, expansive power. He wanted to reshape the U.S. economy to make us an industrial powerhouse. And the basis of that would be big business. He was a New Yorker. He believed in big business. He thought it was efficient. He thought that was where the money was to be made. He would have hated that we have a federal small business administration today. And he designed the whiskey tax to be as burdensome as possible on the small farmers, on the small producers. They were, to him, basically just ankle biters who were getting in the way and hindering the big guys. The whiskey tax was based on the size of the still. So small-scale distillers in Western Pennsylvania operated part-time generally. It's kind of, you're farming mainly and you're doing the whiskey on the side. Whereas the big distillers, that was a full-time thing. It was a little bit more similar to factory production as we're used to thinking of it. So because it was still based on the size of the still, the farmers had that higher effective tax rate than the people who were better able to pay. Whiskey tax was so unpopular in the Appalachian region that in most states, the federal government didn't even bother trying to collect it. In Western Pennsylvania, the government went through a parade of officials who were either intimidated or tarred and feathered before they landed on someone tough enough to collect the tax. John Neville was a Revolutionary War veteran. He was one of the biggest landowners in Western PA. He was probably the biggest slave owner in a time and place where most of those people couldn't have afforded slaves regardless of their views on slavery. He was also the top whiskey producer in the region, which meant he was effectively being paid to put his competition out of business. In the summer of 1794, a tax collector came out from Philadelphia, and Neville helped him collect taxes in the region. At Mingo Creek, which is an area in eastern Washington County, where the rebellion was at its height. In fact, it was so, it's hard to get the maps to work right on PowerPoint, but you can see that this all took place in a pretty concentrated area. And we can go back to the previous slide. Yeah, so in that area there where you saw all those dots, the local militia leaders have essentially set up a shadow government, even with their own courts. So this is what Neville and the tax collector are riding into. They visit this farmer. He had actually kind of been a Neville guy, but here he is jerking him around. And at the end of this argument, somebody fires shots, and the whiskey rebellion has been touched off in earnest. A group of farmers converge on Neville's mansion, like everything else he did. It was the biggest and best in the region. And after 2 days of battle, the house of Bower Hill was burned to the ground. So now the rebels have a taste, and they decide to go bigger. They turn their sights on Pittsburgh, where most of the federal activity happened in the region. So they wanted to burn Pittsburgh, and they wanted to seize the guns from Fort Fayette, which was the successor to Fort Duquesne and Fort Pitt. So this is quite a move that they're looking to make. And I mean, Pittsburgh was not nearly as significant a place as it is now, but the residents of Pittsburgh obviously were not happy with this. And they managed to talk the rebels down to having a triumphal march through the town, where we'll give you food and we'll give you whiskey, and then we'll give you a boat ride back across the river. And they also said, you know, maybe don't take the guns because the army needs them to fight the Native Americans. And if there was one thing that Western Pennsylvania frontiersmen hated more than the federal government, unfortunately, it was the Native Americans. So this whole situation was too much for President George Washington. Now, Alexander Hamilton, who, you know, was always trying to put a bug in Washington's ear about something. He had been nagging him for years to send troops into the forks of the Ohio, as this region was called. And Washington, of course, was always concerned about the precedent he was setting as the first president of a democratic country. And he really did not like this idea of turning troops on his own citizens. But the degree of lawlessness was such that he couldn't really ignore it. I mean, there was even talk about creating a breakaway state. So Washington got troops together, and he led them personally as far as Bedford. This is about the only time in American history where a president led troops in the field. After that, he turned over the army to Light Horse Harry Lee, who was the governor of Virginia, and Alexander Hamilton happened to be there. Surprise. So, as this is all happening, the rebels are sort of losing momentum. They've had this big thing with Pittsburgh, and it's kind of like, well, now what do we do? And around this time, they get word that the troops are coming. And they realize that they're not going to be able to resist. And they start thinking about, oh, we could all be arrested. So the rebellion was basically over by the time the troops got there. They, in what was called the Dreadful Night, the government forces rounded up a couple dozen men. A lot of them ended up being tortured in the winter cold. And then they were taken off to Philadelphia for trial. This was another one of the problems with the whiskey tax and the whole situation. There was no federal court in Pittsburgh. So if you got in trouble with the whiskey tax, you had to go leave your farm for weeks, losing much needed labor to go to Philadelphia to deal with your legal situation. However, the whiskey rebels, trials, did not go very well for the government. In the end, the men were released and pardoned. Herman Husband was among those arrested, but he was too ill and died before he got home. Interestingly, many of the concerns of the rebellion were dealt with soon after it ended. The Ohio River was opened to commerce. The whiskey tax was repealed after a few years. The mint opened and hard currency slowly started to trickle out. And after all of these Federalists, all these years of Washington and Adams, Thomas Jefferson was elected president, and he was more of a farmer-friendly guy. He was still a big planter like George Washington, but he had a different vision for the country than Alexander Hamilton did. So let's skip ahead. We can go to the next one. If anyone is interested in reading more, I read this book and interviewed the author. Brady Kreitzer is a Western Pennsylvania historian at Robert Morris University. One of the nice things about him being a Western Pennsylvania guy is that he's been to all the sites where the Whiskey Rebellion happened. So he mentions in there if those sites still exist, if they don't, what's there. So it's sort of a nice local angle to this situation. So we'll go to the next slide here. Is anyone familiar with Freeze Rebellion? Maybe one or two people. That's yeah, I hadn't really heard about it before I did all this research. So this Freeze Rebellion happened in the Lehigh Valley. In 1798, the French Revolution was going on. France was also at war with England, as it often tended to be. The U.S. is trying to stay neutral in this whole situation. But where neutrality is not going on is in the capital, Philadelphia, where party politics is taking off. This is the time when the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed. They increased the years of residency immigrants needed to become citizens. They allowed for the imprisonment or deportation of non-citizens who were deemed dangerous at any time. And they banned false or malicious publications against federal officials. This was one of the most serious attacks on the First Amendment in the history of the United States. In addition to these concerns about rights, the free speech rights, Pennsylvania Germans were concerned because, we still don't quite fit in. Are we going to be like the aliens that they're trying to get rid of? Now, eventually all this stuff did get repealed or expired, but for the moment, this was a pretty ugly situation. In addition, the federal government needed money again, and so it decided to do a federal tax on houses, land, and slaves. Some assessors, when they were doing their work, decided that the house tax should also account for the number of window panes in the house. So when you're digging down to that level, people are starting to get kind of annoyed, and it's kind of like, what's really the basis for this tax? People are doing it different ways. So into all this steps John Freeze. He was an auctioneer, and in those days, auctioneers were pretty important business owners because they got around to different communities, they handled a lot of money, they knew a lot of people. So he starts organizing protests. Liberty poles start being put up in Northampton and Montgomery counties. Women even supposedly poured hot water on tax assessors from second-story windows. I don't know if it was always water. There's some question about that. So in addition to mistrusting the reason for the tax, again, we have this issue of the farmers may not have had the hard currency to pay. In this situation, John Adams used the Sedition Act to send in federal troops to the Macungie area. Fries and a handful of other men were captured. We can jump forward to the end of that slide. There's two more. Yeah. And so there was some work about people got captured, would try and break them out. And Fries was found guilty of treason, and he was sentenced to hang. In the end, John Adams decided that these people should just be considered rioters, not insurrectionists. And he pardoned everyone who had been arrested. He did this over the objections of the cabinet, who wanted to really stick it to the farmers. And this is, it's interesting that the Lower Macungie Township Historical Society, a year or two ago, put out a documentary about Fries Rebellion. The still there comes from that video. You can actually find it on PCM's website. But it's an interesting little video, thinking about having pretty good production values for being a local production like that. So that's Fries Rebellion. And there's one other variation I want to talk about, another corollary to the Farmer Rebellion of early America. And that's the Slave Rebellion. These were far more numerous than farmer rebellions. They were probably the most numerous type of rebellion in the first half of the 19th century. The most famous, of course, was Nat Turner's Rebellion in Southern Virginia in 1831. And it is not hard to understand why Nat Turner wanted to rebel. The flashpoint of his rebellion is a little bit unclear, though. He was considered a prophet, and he saw, he said he saw visions, including one. He'd been thinking about rebelling for a long time, but right before the rebellion, it's believed that he had some sort of experience that drove it to be, let's do it now. His plan had some similarities to the farmer rebellions that we've talked about, but his plan was far more violent. In the middle of the night, Nat Turner got his men together, and the plan was to slaughter all the white people on the plantation where he lived. Then they moved down the pike, doing the same thing at every plantation they visited. The goal was the arsenal, the county seat of Jerusalem. Nat Turner's men were literally marching to Zion. But the problem for them was word got around pretty quickly, even in a fairly rural area. White Southerners had pretty well-developed strategies for stopping slave rebellions before, nipping them in the bud. Nat Turner's men killed approximately 50 people, but then their progress slowed as they were sort of debating, like, where do we go next? And they started to run into resistance from armed white people. Eventually, there was a large enough force that they were basically, defeated, captured, dispersed. Nat Turner himself was the one who was able to hold out the longest in the woods. Eventually, he was captured, and like most of the people who were involved with the rebellion, was executed. In fact, it was not just executions through the judicial system. Poor white people who didn't even own slaves started going crazy on whatever black people they could find. And the slave owners actually were stepping in to try to stop this, if only to protect what they saw as their property. Slave rebellions are important to our discussion because if we go to the next slide, they inform how the victors react. And there are two concepts I think are important here. One is power distance, and the other is how the government wants to be seen. Power distance is the extent to which power is distributed unequally. A low power distance is where both sides are sort of not that much difference between them. In other cases, there's a chasm between who has power and who doesn't. In Shays' Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion, the government had low power distance from the farmers. You know, if you look at this is a seal of Kentucky. This sort of demonstrates an American ideal of everyone being equal, where the frontiersman and the businessman are shaking hands and are basically on the same level. So the government, I think, also realized that things after Shays' Rebellion and Whiskey Rebellion had cooled off. And, you know, there was also this factor where in a democratic society, you need to curry favor with the voters to win elections. And you don't want to be seen as tyrannical. So the democratic system created incentives for the government to be less harsh on the rebels. In a monarchical system, there is high power distance. That's what we saw with Nat Turner's rebellion. The power of white slave owners and black slaves was so great that, you know, the incentive really was for the Southern white people to reinforce their supremacy, and there was no incentive to go easy. So the incentive really was to crack down, to show who's the boss. This happened with Nat Turner's rebellion, and also this is an image of the most prominent peasant rebellion in English history, which was Wat Tyler's rebellion of 1381. You can see here, Richard II is in the blue, more in the sort of in the center, and is allowing the killing of the peasant leader Wat Tyler in the red there. So, you know, this again, high power distance, the king and the peasants. The king wants to show he's in charge. I don't really need to give in to the peasants. And it ended in a very ugly way. So we'll go to the next slide. Especially with Shays' Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion, the views of historians have sort of changed. Initially, and for the first good 100 years or so, historians strongly sided with the government. The government was seen to be in the right. The farmers were these hillbilly rabble-rousers. They were, you know, there was little reason to respect them. And after all, who takes on American heroes like George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and tries to stick it to them? So you can see this painting was made of George Washington as a hero leading his troops to slap down the Whiskey Rebellion. But more recently, historians in the past, 80 to 100 years have given more credence to the idea that farmers in these situations were the low man on the totem pole, who were put in an impossible situation. These farmers were fighting against unfair and unreasonable demands, and the government was seriously uninterested in helping them. Of course, if you are from one of those areas where the rebellion took place, and you might even be descended from some of the people who took part, you probably have a pretty positive view, or a more positive view, that's been the case for, basically since those times, that in Western PA, in Western Mass, in the Lehigh Valley, there have been people who, this was our area making its name standing up to the government. And of course, in Nat Turner's case, a man who was viewed as this extremely dangerous man has also become a symbol of Black power and agency. We'll go to the next slide. If we could go back one, there we go. So what was it about the 1780s and 1790s? What made the first years of the Republic so conducive to farmer rebellions? It should be pretty clear that the issues with not having hard currency was a major issue. There's also something called the Tocqueville effect, named after Alexis de Tocqueville, on the right there, the French political theorist. He's most known for writing a book about democracy in America, which a lot of readers have said seems to have been pretty far-sighted. But he also created this idea that revolutions happen after conditions start to improve, not when they're at the rock bottom. The idea is that people start to get buoyed up by these gains that they're getting. Things are getting better. So as things are getting better, you have less and less tolerance for smaller stuff. So in the farmer rebels situation, they had just had this huge breakthrough in freedom with the American Revolution. They had achieved their independence. So when they saw the US government doing things that seemed like it was backsliding away from democracy, they thought, well, this is not what we signed up for. We really are not going to have this. And then there's this question of a changing paradigm. We can go to the next slide. Alan Taylor, a historian, was writing in the 1980s about the 200th anniversary of Shays' Rebellion. And he said the rebellion was taking place during a paradigm shift in how governments dealt with dissent. So we can put the pictures up there. There we go. Yeah. Before American independence, maybe going back to medieval times or even earlier, the assumption was that the government would rule with an iron fist. Now, it was understood that peasants might rise on occasion when conditions became unbearable. But it wasn't like they had a legal right to rise. It was always extra legal. So you can do it if you want to, but you better be prepared to suffer the consequences. In the democratic system, the founding fathers provided what they hoped would be a way out of that cycle of violence. In a democratic society, the government is supposed to be answerable to the people. Criticizing the government, which once was not allowed, is not only allowed, but is now protected. Political violence was delegitimized. And in its place, we got three powerful tools: protest, lobbying, and voting. All of those were now legal ways to shape the government. And we'll go to the next slide here. It's worth recalling the words of the First Amendment. I highlighted the most relevant piece here, where it says that the government is to respect, one of the rights that we have as citizens is to petition the government for a redress of grievances, where we're able to tell the government our problems, even our problems with them, and tell them to change it. And they can't retaliate. Or, well, there are obviously some guardrails there, but you can't just retaliate against the citizens because they told you that you're doing things wrong. So it's understandable, though, I think, that the rebels of the 1780s and 90s were not really there yet. They didn't immediately make that transition to the democratic paradigm. They fell back on what they knew. They were many of them Revolutionary War veterans. So the tool they knew to use was when the government starts acting up, you rebel. They were not, hardly anyone in America was used to living under this new paradigm. In fact, most people, maybe for the whole history of the world, had mainly known the government as a force of oppression. So this was, we've called it a democratic experiment. And it was also an experiment to try to live in this new system. So we'll hop to the next slide here, and we'll see that since 1800, farmer dissatisfaction has almost always been channeled into legal forms of petition. The first great movement came in the populist era in the second half of the 1800s. The National Grange was the first major organization to lobby for rural people and for farmers. They were opposing, Alexander Hamilton was off the scene now, but they were opposing big business that was trying to basically jerk the farmers around. And this was the era when the railroads were at their height of power. And they were charging these high freight rates that the farmers said, these are going to put us out of business. And the populists were important enough that they were able to win some votes in the Electoral College when they ran a presidential candidate. Those are the green ones you can see in some of those western states. So this is the 1892 Electoral College. And just as a side note, take a look at how many electoral votes Pennsylvania has compared to everybody else. So it was really New York and us who were the tail wagging the dog. So then after the populist era came the Great Depression. Farmers, were hugely affected by this. One of the strategies tried out in the Midwest were farmer strikes, where farmers tried to avoid buying or selling, and basically to show people how much they needed them. Unfortunately, this is a very difficult thing to pull off. Didn't really work too well. And then in 1979 came the tractorcade. This was when there's an estimated 5,000 pieces of farm machinery were driven to the National Mall in DC. And farmers were protesting for these changes. I have a picture of that in a couple slides. It's quite interesting. So if we go to the next slide here. There were a few little things that could be called farmer rebellions in the 20th century. These did not seem to get a lot of support. In 1917, a group of Oklahoma farmers planned to march on Washington, subsisting, they said, on barbecue and green corn, hence the name Green Corn Rebellion. Unfortunately, their plan also included burning bridges and cutting telegraph wires. So a posse got together and stopped them before they got too far. 150 people ended up being convicted. Then this was really more of a movement than a real rebellion, I think. But in the late 70s and early 80s came the Sagebrush Rebellion. Western ranchers wanted the federal government to loosen up grazing rules and transfer a lot of land to the states, a lot of federal land to the states. This revives that concern we saw about power distance, because we had these Western ranchers feeling like these distant, powerful people in Washington are making rules without understanding us and without really caring about us. However, However, this didn't, as far as I can tell, it didn't get much traction. People seem to have thought that the legal arguments that were being advanced were pretty weak and even self-serving, because a lot of the argument here was, well, why don't you transfer all this land and then we'll make money off of it through mineral rights or ranching or whatever. So, I mean, we did see that public opinion shifted on Shays' Rebellion, Whiskey Rebellion. So, who knows, in 100 years, maybe people will think more favorably of those rebellions, but they certainly didn't in their time. So let's jump to this slide. This is an image of the tractorcade. It's quite interesting to see all those tractors converging on this U.S. Capitol. So I would argue that the farmer rebels from the 1780s and 90s had some reasonable grievances. They may not have acted on them in an ideal way, but even in their failure, they pointed us to a time when democracy would be able to serve the purposes of the aggrieved. The founders designed a system in which, ideally, political violence would no longer be necessary, and protest, lobbying, and voting would be effective tools for seeking redress of grievances. The promise of democracy is that we have a right to influence the government and not face retribution. Though it took a little while for this to become clear, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the democratic system that were built up around them largely secured the freedoms that many of the farmers had fought for in the American Revolution. Thank you.
Some questions? Any questions?
We're from New York. What happened to the cow? I'm really curious about that.
Someone cut the cow loose, so I guess I'm not entirely sure if the cow went home with the farmer, but it was cut loose.
Ran for political office.
The series is available online?
Yes.
On the website?
Yeah, so you can do the QR code, or if you look it up on lancasterfarming.com.
Thank you.
That was, I have a million questions, but I also have memory loss, so I have a million to ask you right now. But anyway, it just strikes me like sometimes we want to balance the equation, and I just don't quite understand how people in centers of power can deny the people that are feeding them some sort of graciousness is the only word I can think of. It just seems like the equation is unbalanced. It almost, and I don't mean this to sound harsh, but it seems like the people at the center of the power, they're so stupid they don't even know they're stupid. You understand? But yet, we've had a long history in America where we disdain rural people. I mean, you can see this in mom and pop kettle and popular culture, especially in the 20th century. It just, I mean, do you have any thoughts on that? It just seems like, don't you want to eat, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it is there has been this long running, use the word disdain, and that certainly many people have gone there. Yeah, it's, you may have read the book White Trash that came out about 10 years ago, which was sort of a study of the marginalization of poor white people who, like in the antebellum South, they were treated as kind of this other looked down on group, sort of in some ways even thought of as less than the slaves. So it was, and it goes through into the 20th century, where even things like trailer parks became this symbol of otherness. So it's still a question that we're dealing with. And, you know, I was thinking too about all of the various types of political violence that we've seen in recent years. It's sort of hard to make a direct comparison, but it is, you know, whether it's something like the January 6th attack on the Capitol, or, you know, there was a shooting of a health insurance CEO. And in some of those situations, you know, are we, people will see things, for example, in the shooting of the CEO. It's not a rural example, but some people felt that there was some sort of justification there in that it brought attention to criticisms people have of the insurance industry. But on the other hand, you kind of feel like there had to be a better way to do that than to kill someone. So I've strayed a little bit from thinking about specifically rural issues, but yeah, I mean, with the rural population shrinking, and I also just did an overview of a book called Rural versus Urban, where they political scientists looked at this whole situation where there's been the increasing polarization of red state, blue state, and how ruralness really has been such an important factor in that, how people continue to feel marginalized in rural areas, and continues to, you know, people are pretty angry about, you know, feeling like they don't have a voice.
Thank you.
Yep. Yes.
The reason that whiskey was so important to the Western farmers was that they couldn't afford to transport anything like foodstuffs the whole way to Philadelphia by wagon. But whiskey was sort of a very compact, high value commodity they could transport there. Now, I was wondering, did Pittsburgh ever get connected by canal to the eastern markets, and did that improve the farmers' livelihood prospects if it happened?
Yeah, so Pennsylvania was the biggest canal state that there was, and the making a east-west connection between Philly and Pittsburgh was one of the top goals of the canal building program. So that happened, and we did get that connection. Of course, the canals took so much time to build that by the time this whole system was built out, the railroads were really becoming a better option. And so we did get that option, although it ended up having a pretty small heyday.
How did they get the canals over the mountains? We lived in Western Pennsylvania, so appreciate the travel from there to here.
Yeah.
I'm trying to visualize how they got a canal.
Locks.
Locks.
Well, they didn't. They had a system of, when they got to the Allegheny, they would unload the cargo, and they would have a system of wagons or whatever. They would winch them up the mountain, down the other side, and then put them back on the boats to the canals. So there was a manual system to take them over.
Yeah, I mean, one kind of connected thing is the C&O Canal. It was supposed to be basically built paralleling the Potomac River and then punch out to the Ohio. But building through that area was so complicated that it took like, I don't know, 12 years or something to build one tunnel. And it finally got from DC to Cumberland, Maryland, 8 years after the railroad got to Cumberland. So,
Phil, so you talked about a couple of political transformations, paradigm shifts. You talked about the Revolution of 1800 with Jefferson, and he obviously came in with a very farmer constituency appeal. And then you mentioned 1892, which if I remember correctly, there was a populist president who ran there. But that was before the 1896 election, which is really the transformation of the Democratic Party, right? I mean, right? 1892 to 1896. I mean, the farmer revolts of the 1870s and 1880s led to the political movement that really changed the Democratic Party from what it was, the Bourbon Democrats, to, what's his name? Ran for president. Thank you. It's right there.
Cotton's Rebellion.
Right. So, I don't know, did you want to speak anything about, I mean, whereas, yeah, I mean, I agree. There are many times when I think you've got more corporate interests or whatever you want to call it, that larger moneyed interest, then yeah, it does seem like, farmers do, at least in some of what you're talking about today, do seem a little marginalized. But their grievances over a few years, I mean, eventually politically, I mean, they landed somewhere, right? I mean, there was some transformation of the political system. And I'm just using Jefferson and Jennings Bryan. So I don't know if you wanted to speak more.
Yeah,
about
I mean, I have not really gotten to the part of the series yet where I deal with populism, so I haven't studied that really. I did a couple years ago when the Pennsylvania State Range hit its 100th or 150th, I guess. I did do a little bit of research on that, and you'll notice a lot of range organizations sprouted up during the Panic of 1873. So that was, that was one example of the farmer protests being tied directly to events. I should say too that it's not that farmers have no power right now. I mean, the American Farm Bureau Federation is considered a pretty powerful and prominent lobby. Pennsylvania Farm Bureau is certainly a leading farm organization at the state level.
Another thing about change in that period of the 1890s that you referenced, it's a huge explosion in magazines, newspapers, the rise of William Randolph Hearst and other people in yellow journalism. So it's another advance in technology, printing, and stuff, mass production, but also industrial wages where people, so there's that sense of getting more information. Thus, with information, you look for places to place that, whatever the intellectual activity that goes on in your brain in response to news and stuff like that. So it's a pretty powerful period in American history. Leads up to the progressive movement.
Yeah, hey Jim, can I double down on that also? It's also considered the women's era, the 1890s. And so what some of these Western states whose representation was low, and obviously they were farm-based economies and they wanted the representation higher, they went ahead in the 1890s and legalized, or at least at the state level, had women vote so they could get that representation. So women are kind of part of that farmers movement too. Mary Elizabeth Lease, is that first woman lawyer in Kansas? So. Used to be a teacher. That's great. Thank you, Phil. That was amazing. Thank you so much. We will be doing our next talk will be the last Friday of August, and it'll be Dr. Scott Shealy talking about foodways here in Lancaster. Thank you so much for coming. Feel free to grab a treat on your way out. I will ask, don't go inside of the park. We still just want to really open tomorrow. If you want to go to the fence and check out what's going on, that's great. Don't go inside the fence, please. We don't have anybody in there, and it's just a liability issue. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Sorry, you can hear all that.
We're going to video and talking about hopefully opening tomorrow.
Which is always the best, right?
Their morning show is a live broadcast here next week.
Isn't that something? 1 o'clock. Out of bed comes some good. I know.
Not even the marginalization, but fodder for comedies. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. No, but I know exactly what you're talking about.
So that's when everybody else is like rushing up here.